Welcome, Patreons, to part 2 of episode 19 of Anti-Fascist Dad podcast. From the Mormon Priesthood to Trans Advocate Dad with Blair Hodges. My name is Matthew Remski. I'm really grateful for your support. I hope this project brings some joy and hope and utility to your works and days. You can find me on Blue Sky and Instagram under my name, and I'm on YouTube and TikTok as Anti-Fascist Dad. The Patreon for this show is at Anti-Fascist Dad Podcast. You're already here if you're listening to it immediately, because subscribers get early access to every second part of the main feed episodes. In the show notes, I'll just remind you, you'll find a link to my almost published book, Anti-Fascist Dad, Urgent Conversations with Young People in Chaotic Times. It drops April 26th, but I'm told that pre-orders really help with visibility. In part 1 of my conversation with my friend Blair, we explored the cultural and political tensions facing transgender youth and the LGBTQ plus community in Utah during this period of rising fascism. He kind of pulled the curtain back on how the state's conservative legislature employs what he calls the Utah way, or I guess everybody calls it the Utah way, which is a method of enacting restrictive MAGA-aligned policies under a veneer of Mormon politeness, and the end result being that marginalized groups are targeted despite local resistance in progressive hubs like Salt Lake City, where Blair lives. He also unpacked his own journey from a devout missionary to an advocate for his trans kid. And the amazing or ironic part of that story was that it was driven by a personal commitment to the faith's original values of supporting the persecuted as he felt he had learned them. We also took a closer look at Mormon theology, specifically how the family proclamation document and the concept of eternal gender serve as foundational barriers to queer acceptance. And he also filled me in on how Mormonism shifted from early communalist roots to embrace white supremacy and nuclear family ideals to achieve mainstream access to American capitalism. So with part 2, we jump back in with an examination of Mormon masculinities. I need to ask you about what part of Mormon masculinity allows for the preacher or the person in authority to actually be publicly vulnerable or to weep. So I did not know any Catholic clerics, for example, who were able to do that. I didn't know anybody in authority who was able to do that. And in fact, I'll tell you that one of the things that probably hooked me into the first high demand group that I got into was the fact that the leader, Michael Roach, who is like a pseudo-Tibetan Buddhist, he would regularly, as he was giving some discourse about Buddhist meditation or philosophy, he would regularly weep. And I thought that was incredible. And I wanted to learn how to do that. I didn't realize the performativity and, everything else that was going on with that. But I just did not grow up with the kind of male authority that you're talking about. What do you think accounts for or permits that type of vulnerability within an obviously patriarchal system?
I see it as an outgrowth of Mormonism's birth in a highly spiritually charismatic era. So it came out of the burnt-over district where there was speaking in tongues, glossalia, big displays of emotion. That was a really big part of it. And as Mormonism became increasingly acceptable to broader society, it sort of left those things by the wayside. So Mormons will still talk about the early days when there was like visions of angels and speaking in tongues and all of these spiritual expressions.
Right.
But that's fallen away, but what hasn't is the emotionality of it. And so the spirit itself, the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit that Mormons are said to feel, which will verify truth, point you in directions to go, it's God sort of directing your life, will give you emotional expression. And this, I hadn't really thought to bring this up, but for me that was weird because I noticed a big difference when I started taking antidepressants and ADHD medication. That element of religiosity kind of stopped because of the tears wouldn't come. I didn't feel emotions in the same way, but I still felt religious and still felt connected to it. But I was like, that's really interesting that pharmaceuticals that I'm taking affect how the Holy Ghost can like communicate with me? So I think it's that like emotionality
Right.
component that we see. And I've had times when I've wept bearing my testimony and have felt, and it's not disingenuous at all. It's you're really
Yeah.
you're really just opening yourself up to vulnerability and expressing and connecting with the community, and that
Yeah.
can lead to this emotional tears and that sort of thing. And it also, instead of speaking in tongues now, that becomes a visible sign of the truth. You're
Yes,
feeling the
right.
Spirit. How do you know? Because the voice is shaking and the tears are coming, and so yeah, it's the Spirit manifesting itself.
Here's a prediction that I would have is that as conservative elements of the Mormon church double down on their normativity, that emotionality will gradually fade away because because I think it will lose its relationship to its charismatic and communal roots.
I think so. We're seeing a rise of alt-right Mormons online
Yeah.
that really badly want to be accepted by the alt-right mainstream. They call themselves Desnat. Don't look it up, people, and nobody say that I'm saying this because I don't want the 300 or whatever people in that little beehive to come and start attacking, because they will, and they're relentless and they'll never give up. But they really
probably
wanna...
have guns too, right, Blair?
Oh, they do. They do.
Yeah.
One of them was like assistant attorney general in Alaska and
great.
lost his job when he was doxxed because of all the transphobic, queerphobic, racist things he was saying online. So that there's a wing of Mormonism that's definitely buying into this new like asshole Christianity that we're seeing from MAGA and from a lot of the religious right now. And so yeah, I don't know if it will end up spreading enough within the church to tamp down on the emotionality side of things, but it's definitely already a contingent of Mormons there who they wouldn't think it's bad to see a president of the church tearing up. They think that's great because whatever the president of the church does is great. But as for them, they're definitely not going to, and they've got their guns and they've got their fuck you attitude.
Right.
But in Mormonism, it would be like frick you attitude.
Got it. Okay. Going more broadly now, one of the things that I think you've clearly had to unlearn and then, sort of retool yourself for is that if you're going to focus on human rights in general or the rights of children in particular, is that you have to sort of realize something about child autonomy that goes way beyond sticking them into a priesthood sort of pipeline when they're 12 years old. And that's going to have to do with figuring out what co-learning means. It has to do with, dismantling the typical assumptions that adults know better about the world than children do. How did you navigate the sort of impulse or the heritage of authoritarianism?
Mm-hmm. I have the advantage of having a wife who is a social worker and who went back and got a master's degree at Brigham Young University, actually, where I was working at the time, the church's university, who really started looking at different ways to think about kids. And we already were not authoritarian. Like, we weren't the kind of parents that were like iron fist, our way or the highway. We were already there. Then we found like the research and the communities that back that stuff up and gave us further ideas. And then having neurodivergent kid definitely will open it up for any parent of like, even just on a pragmatic level of like, oh, the typical ways we work with kids is actually kind of bullshit. And the ways that work better for my neurodivergent kid would actually be great for pretty much every kid.
Yeah, exactly.
If we decided to do that. So that opened it up.
And it's not just bullshit. It's punitive. It's
harmful.
It's cruel.
Yeah. I completely agree. And so I started doing a podcast originally my podcast was called Family Proclamations with an S on the end.
Right.
And it was a tip of the cap to the family proclamation, but I was pluralizing it and saying there's no singular family proclamation. There are proclamations, and here they are. And I was going to interview people from, divorced families,
right,
queer families, adoptive families, foster families, all these different kinds of families and different kind of gender identities and sexualities. So I wanted to start exploring that. And as part of that work, I started looking at like children's rights. I interviewed a fellow named Adam Benferrato, who wrote a terrific book on children's rights, and from a very pragmatic angle laid out like why kids should have more rights than they do. started looking at like the Child Protective Services system and how that functions not really to protect the rights of children, but to protect the ownership rights of particular parents,
Right.
particular privileged
Yeah.
parents. So I started realizing that the systems that we're surrounded by are built by structures of power that need kids to be vulnerable victims who need rescuing and saving and who don't actually have a voice, and who need to be controlled and brought up to be our next little soldiers in our economy. Like we need our little, they need to be able to survive in this world. So yeah, neurodivergent kid, learning about social work kind of ideals and approach, therapeutic approaches to raising kids. The neuroscience behind this all backs it up. Again, it's the same with the trans stuff. First I heard stories and saw how stuff was going. Then I looked at the research and was like, this stuff converges. It makes sense.
I mean, if your cosmology is based upon the eternal nature of the nuclear family, which is, I don't actually really know how that works generation upon generation, because
Right.
like if I die, am I with my two kids or with my parents and then my grandparents as well? And like wouldn't you, everybody, maybe that's the hidden communalism of it, is that in the end you're all in the same family.
Right.
And you all came from Africa or whatever.
Yeah.
Although you won't talk about that part. But
Actually, sorry, the Garden of Eden was in Missouri.
oh,
but
sorry.
to
Okay.
Mormons.
So I guess what I wanted to sort of understand is whether or not that was an additional barrier, which is if your cosmology and your sort of understanding of death and the afterlife includes your children, that sounds like sort of extended ownership, in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I can imagine being a kid and saying, you know what, maybe I'd like to die and be part of another family.
Yeah. For me, I didn't have that experience, but I know Mormons who did. And for my wife, she was raised by a single mom, so it was always kind of strange to hear that, because she didn't have that nuclear family at home, so that ideal didn't exist for her. But yet they still preached that ideal, and she was taught to go for that ideal herself, but it didn't exist for her.
Right.
So, and I think, yeah, I hadn't thought of it in terms of the ownership angle of like parents owning their kids through eternity, but I think that tracks. Also, pay attention to the language we use when we talk about kids. We have custody of our children.
Right.
That's that and like imprisonment are the only contexts in which we use the word custody. So the framework we're thinking about with kids is one of ownership. And for Mormonism, it's on a theological level. They're sealed to you. They belong to you. But I always experienced that as a welcome thing that I wanted. My family wasn't perfect, and my dad was very strict, and I can go into all the baggage I have about it. But overall, like, I wanted to be with my family again. When he was dying, I wanted to know that I would see him again and be with him again and have a family experience again. And I wasn't thinking of going off and like having a bunch of spirit babies and populating my own worlds, or however that would work. And would I have to have my own Jesus too? Or like, how did Mormons don't really get into the weeds there. But just the idea of like being with my family again, it still appeals to me. I don't want to lose my kids when they die. I still want to believe. I'm kind of an agnostic hoper that in some way or in some sense that we can persist in some way eternally and be in relation to each other in some way. And I don't know if that happens, but I would hope it would, and that would be awesome. So it is appealing. I think the draw is more that I just want that to be the case. I think where Mormonism took a wrong turn is by becoming so exclusivist that it was saying it went from saying families can be together forever through Heavenly Father's plan to saying families definitely can't be together forever unless you do these things that we say.
Right.
That's a big difference.
I really have to wonder in this difference I'm going to describe between you and I about the timing of a parental death and the impact upon that kind of idealization or wish, because I can imagine losing my parent as a young person. That's a different type of loss. There would be a real absence, a real hole, something amputated. And when I reflect on my mother dying 5 years ago now, I am very much a materialist about it, not in the sense that she is gone, but in the sense that the memory I have of her is just in my body, right? In my daily actions, I can feel her coming out in humor. I can feel her coming out in, various neurotic things or judgments or, there are good things too, but like, but I can feel like it's like she soaked into my cells somehow and then disappeared as her own individuality. And I don't think that I would have had that impression if I was 16 years old. I don't think I would have formed that set of feelings if I was at the same age at which you last lost your dad.
There's some stuff that pops up. I definitely, it's interesting. Like you said, it tends to be sort of more negative stuff where I'm like, oh, that reminds me of my dad. I'm doing it.
Right.
Oh, that's just like my dad. Holy crap.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I think when you lose a parent at that age, yeah, you haven't built in the day-to-day. It hasn't really sank into the marrow, I think, as much. But a lot of psychological development happens when we're kids. So I think there's a lot of residue. It might not necessarily be consciously connected. Like, I probably couldn't point to all the ways because I was still figuring out who I was as a person as a teenager.
Right.
So I do know that there are some things that definitely are like my father about myself. Usually things that I try to resist. But yeah, it's hard to say.
I do need to speak about the positive things that I feel because they're related to my next question and its complication. My mother would have, for example, hated Jordan Peterson. My mother would have, was always aware of her sort of position within her understanding of class war. My mother was a working class person through and through who attained a certain amount of, dignity and autonomy through a middle class life, but she never forgot who was in control of things and who she needed to fight and who she couldn't trust, right? And those, for good and ill, those very leftist values are inside me just instinctually, right? And they cause this paradox, which is that I think we are all very, very committed as, feeling people to try to, always understand and support each other and create good attachments and repair things when we hurt each other and never throw each other away. We want security in our family life. And then we can also be aware that, external, very toxic forces like fascism are rising, are near, and that they repudiate everything that we value about relationships. Like, fascism is the end of conversation and persuasion, and it's in the realm of pure power. And so I'm wondering whether you feel some of the same tension that on one hand, we have to do so much work to preserve our good relationship skills for community and family life, but we also absolutely need to learn when we need to shut fascists out.
I think how I want to frame a response is through the lens of the privilege of disengagement. Growing up in the family I did, in the religion I did, being white, middle class, the majority religion in a conservative state, I didn't have to think too much about oppression or about anything that what I would understand to be fascism. That was all something from the past. That was something from like Nazi Germany and these terrible things in history that we'd kind of solved.
Yeah.
That was from like the days of slavery up until Martin Luther King delivered his amazing speech, and that like fixed racism. And so I wasn't very reflective on the ways that fascistic tendencies could persist in American politics and could even be, I converted fully to being a Democrat with Barack Obama's candidacy.
Right.
Even how he used the tools of the state to do terrible things in terms of, especially internationally.
Right.
And what he didn't do for immigration and the failures that I've now come to see. And I still respect him a lot. I wouldn't take that vote back at all, but I was in a place to not have to really think much about it.
Right.
It's kind of like, I would say it's kind of like I lived in this house in the upper floor of this house. I'm not in the basement, I'm on the ground floor. And when the floods come, they're flooding the basement, and I don't live down there.
Yeah.
So I don't really have to think about it much.
Right.
But now, seeing the rise of MAGA and Donald Trump, I feel like my carpet's getting wet now. Like the basement has always been flooding, but now it's coming up into my level. And I think a lot of white people are experiencing it this way. The the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings in 2020, I had already felt like I didn't like that I was anti-racist, but I didn't realize anti-racist was a practice you had to actually engage in. I thought it was just like a belief you had that like,
Yeah.
I'm not prejudiced against black people, so of course I'm anti-racist.
Right, right.
So
that's just
I guess
skipping out on the issue.
Yeah. So for me, I needed to come to a place of awareness that dangers persisted and in some ways had always been there, and that if history does, I don't remember who said this, but if history doesn't repeat itself, it often rhymes.
Yeah.
And that we're rhyming. And now the shock to me is like, well, what the hell do I do? I'm like, and feeling pressure as a white privileged person who came up in a middle class upbringing to be the one to solve all the problems. The more I have dug into it, though, and the more I've thought of myself as an anti-fascist in addition to like an anti-racist, is to listen to the marginalized people themselves.
Yeah.
They're like, that's where to start. Listening to those conversations. They've been having them forever.
Yeah.
There's so much wisdom there and knowledge and patience and like grit and determination and tragedy and sorrow and everything mixed up, that if that's where I've really tried to redirect my energies to, like, if I can listen to those stories, experiences, desires, and amplify them myself, then I am engaging in anti-fascist practice, not as some like white savior that can fix all the problems, but part of a collective groundswell and a movement that realizes the house is fucking flooding.
Yeah.
And everybody's going to be hurt if we don't do something.
Finishing up, Blair, I know that we have a few differences just coming out of our backgrounds, and I think a lot of it might also be attributed to the fact that as much as you have grown in kind of dialectical relationship with your realizations about the Mormon church, you still live in Salt Lake City. You're surrounded by Mormon community. It's still, I mean, part of your extended family life. And what I've noticed about you over the years is that you're always reaching out across various aisles. And I think you have an amazing facility for talking with people who are at different stages of that same journey. And I think that's such a crucial role, particularly now, and particularly as we see more and more radicalized groups that will fall apart, and their members are going to need to be, lent a hand at some point, at least socially. But one of the differences that is between us is that I'm probably more of a Marxist than you, more of a materialist than you. Like, I'm pretty convinced that, we mostly are where we are because of the material conditions of capitalism. And if I just talk like that, which is, where my convictions lie, I think sometimes it can lead me to, make statements and have attitudes and to push ideas that are not accessible or workable to most people, right? And I don't think that I have to reach everybody or speak to everybody. But I do think that you are a more moderate and fluid communicator than I am. And so I'm wondering if you think that's, true. How does that strike you? And would you have any advice for me as the friendly Mormon?
I feel this is a funny question because I feel like I've definitely become more radicalized over the past like 5-ish years.
Right.
And, but also, I'll put it in terms of what happened with my Mormonism. So, like, being a member of the church, I'm still a member of the church. I'm a member of record. I haven't like removed my name. I stopped attending a while ago. The reason I was still attending, even though I disagreed with the church on its approach to racism, on its approach to gay people, queer people, trans folks, its positions on women, and excluding them from positions of authority, I still saw goodness in the community, and I still saw potential for change.
Right.
And so by engaging in my local activities, I was teaching Sunday school. I loved doing that. I loved teaching a class.
Right.
And so I would go and I would do that, and I would hear things at church that really hurt, but I would also be there to make comments, and I had to learn in that context how to communicate difference without burning all my social capital up.
Yeah.
Because I could have gone in there and been like, that's transphobic.
Yeah.
But everybody would be like,
What?
the hell? Like that, yeah.
Yeah.
What's his problem?
Right.
Like, he's a weirdo. So I had to find ways to instead use kind of speak in my Mormon language, using Mormon reasoning and using Mormon scripture or prophetic voices to say, well, God values all humans. I'm uncomfortable with the way we're talking about trans people. You may disagree with the way that they live, but they're still children of God or whatever. So I had to develop ways of communicating difference in a setting where it wasn't necessarily welcome,
Right.
while still maintaining some buy-in from the people that I was speaking to. So I had just a lot of practice at doing that. It goes back to the Mormon mission, where that's what you're doing. You're trying to be persuasive, and so you want to connect with people on shared beliefs and then build from there. Gordon B. Hinckley, that prophet I mentioned, who was like the prophet of my youth, the one who I looked up to as the literal prophet of God, he used to quote Joseph Smith saying, hey, bring all the good you have to us, and let's see if we can add to it. And having that kind of attitude is, I think, more effective. It's hard, so much harder for me to do it right now. I have so much less patience
Right.
and so much less belief that some of these MAGA folks, like if they're not convinced right now, I just don't believe they can be. So I'm definitely so much less idealistic with this, like speak to them in their language and like connect with them where you share values. I still think there's places for that. I also know how that can be deployed to shut marginalized people up and tone police and be like, well, the trans people are being too mean, and that's why everybody's cracking down on them. And if they would just, be nicer and more normal, then
If
then
they
they'd
would be more
accepted.
Mormon.
Yeah, be more Mormon. So there's the balance.
Yeah, okay, so that's you run into
Yes.
this difficulty. Yeah, you run into this difficulty where you might actually be modeling a kind of liberalism that then becomes the right way of doing things, right?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So my advice for you is to keep doing what you're doing. You're bringing in so many different voices. Like you said, you don't have to convince everybody. That's not any of our jobs. And I am I'm a person who says, everybody do your efforts. I'm so tired of trying to police everybody's efforts, with the exception of reactionary centrists, who I will criticize at every opportunity. Because I think they're the worst. But
Well, and why? Why do we? Okay, we both have that impulse. Why? I mean, I think we share this. Like somebody like Ezra Klein really gets our goat.
yeah.
And what is it? Is it because? Okay, I'm gonna try something here. Do you think it's because? And maybe this is very visible to you, that Klein and other sort of reactionary centrist pundit types are able to mobilize some of the same skills that you actually have for reaching out, quote unquote, to various populations. But what they're doing is they're trying to accumulate power through doing that networking.
Yeah, they're leaning into right-wing desires and directions, policies, and etc. Under the guise of getting wins for liberals. Like, hey guys, you know how we could win? Be more like the other guys. And then we're and so I think where I get so upset about it is I used to be kind of like that. I think we reserve our most our most harsh feelings for our own. What we're seeing is like our own maybe inclinations or past behavior in that behavior.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. There's a very good reason that I go after toxic, charismatic male figures, because I get it. I understand what that is, and I know what I had to do in myself to face it.
Yeah, so I would say for your communication, I love what you're doing. You're reconnecting with Catholic tradition in really nuanced ways. You are tapping into, I mean, you're talking to me, right? I think, like with Conspirituality podcast, you have differences with on that show that come out that are really interesting. And I know it can't always be easy to do that, but and it doesn't have to be forever for anybody. This is the other thing I've learned. I don't have to be everywhere all the time and stay the same. So like when I was doing that Mormon thing and going every week, what changed was one week I was going to teach my class, and my then 12-year-old, who now I understood wasn't just queer, but was actually non-binary, I was walking out the door and they were sitting on the couch looking at me, and they just had this expression on their face of love, but also just like, it wasn't disapproval, but I knew they're just like, why is Dad doing this? Like, they know what the church was teaching. They know that the church opposes their actual very existence.
Right.
And I couldn't, for the 100th time, sit down and be like, but listen, this is how the church changes, is from within and people being there. And I believe that's true. I think there still needs to be people there doing that. And I know many that are, and God bless them, and I root for them.
Yeah.
But in that moment with my own kid, the thought struck me so deep in my head, and it said, stop trying to be a hero to the church. And I realized that was part of what I was doing. Yeah, because of this person.
There was somebody right in front of you.
Right. And I wanted my allegiance to them to be absolutely unquestionable.
Yeah.
That I didn't have to add an explanation to it at all, because I would stand by them wherever they are.
Yeah.
And that Mormonism itself told me to do it because it said how important my family is. And if Mormonism sets up a place where my own child, like literal places, temples, edifices, places of worship, where my own child is literally not allowed to go, then I'm not going to go there either. I hope other people who can help things change continue to go, but it's not going to be me, and it doesn't have to be.
Blair Hodges, thank you so much. It's so great to talk with you.
Thanks, Matthew.
So, as I mentioned in part one, there's a section in my upcoming book about how the moment of becoming aware of trans people's existence for Blair echoes an experience that I had. And so I thought I would end by just reading from that. I didn't know any trans people until I was well into my 30s, or at least I wasn't aware that I did. I'm sure I had, actually. I remember a friend going on social media and asking for financial help for the medical costs of transitioning gender. And this person and I hadn't spoken about this before, and I was really surprised. And it was hard for me to wrap my head around at the time. But why was that? I've never had such strong feelings about a friend getting cosmetic surgery or changing jobs or becoming a parent or even getting involved in a new religion. So what was it about my friend wanting to affirm her gender with medication and surgery that was so different? The only answer I have is that there was something about my friend wanting to no longer live and be seen as a man that made me question what being a man meant to me. What did it mean if this was a state of being that could change? Was this part of my life, which I had never questioned before, now suddenly a zone of uncertainty? Now, for the week after my friend posted their call out for support, I wandered around the city in a daze, and I began to see what feminist philosopher Judith Butler calls gender performativity, or the process by which humans, cued by culture, put together their appearance of gender and act it out in relation to each other every day. I was riding the subway, and I looked at all the people, and I realized that if I was honest, I couldn't know for sure who was a man and who was a woman. But I had spent my life assuming that I could. And then based on that assumption, I'd made all kinds of unconscious decisions about what they must be like or what they should be doing with their lives. And I realized that if I wanted to confirm who was a man and who was a woman, I would have to inspect their bodies somehow and make a decision about what their genitals looked like. And how creepy is that? What business is it of mine? Could I imagine walking through the world and not even caring what other people's sex and gender were? Wouldn't it just be better to relate to everyone as people? Over time, it dawned on me that trans people belong to the group that has always known gender is a performance, whereas for a cisgendered person like myself, I've been trained to accept the appearances and behaviors of manhood in a way that makes them seem natural and normal, and I would also say invisible. Trans people are just people. They're not magical unicorns here for the spiritual education of cisgendered people. But I will say this for all you cis anti-fascists out there: if you can recognize that transness is a reality of the human family, Your own understanding of how gender expectations have both privileged and harmed you will expand, and that will put you in the mindset of smashing the fascist demand that men and women be frozen into opposing roles so that inequality can fester. It will encourage you to stand up for trans people, a minority among us who deserve life and respect and freedom just like everyone else. Take care of each other, everyone.